Hello everyone, welcome to the inaugural Trans-Tasman online symposium on updates in ageing from both sides of the ditch. I'd like initially to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, and I'm sure Kay will acknowledge the traditional owners of that land across the ditch. Welcome everyone, it's 6:25 in the morning in Perth, it's not sunrise. I understand that the Kiwis are almost going home for dinner now. So we're going to have quite an exciting program. We're kicking off today with Maori and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ageing. We're following with falls, supporting older people in residential care, then cognitive impairment in hospitals, what does it mean? And finally, the final session of the day will be community support services, similarities and differences across the Tasman. For those of you who have seen the program will realise that there's half an hour between each of the sessions. We'll all be warning you throughout the day, but when you do leave, make sure you don't leave for all, just leave yourself. But we'll explain that as we go along through the day. I might just hand over to my co-convener, Kay Shannon, from that faraway place called New Zealand. I'm sure that Kay would also like to welcome you to today's symposium. Kay.
Thank you, Leon. Kia ora and welcome from New Zealand and the New Zealand Association of Gerontology. We're all very happy here this morning, and Oliver will let you know why when he starts his presentation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we live and work on and our ancestors. Thank you everybody and welcome.
All right. So we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. I might just remind you all, and I'm sure Mark, who's the convener of the facilitator of the first session, will remind you as well, that through the day we love questions, and if you could put it through your chat facility on your screen. So we'll go through that. I'm sure Mark and every other facilitator will go through that as well through the day. So we love questions, just put them through on chat and I'm sure that we'll be able to deal with them as we go along. This is the inaugural Trans-Tasman online symposium, and we also would value your feedback about how this symposium goes. So even if you love it, I'm sure you'll have some reasons why you think it can be improved. For example, you might want to change the convener from Australia and get rid of him. That would be a very welcome opportunity for you to do so. So you remember to do your feedback. This is an important part of us learning about how we can improve this session. There's probably not too much more that we have to get along with at this stage. Kay, is there anything else you'd like to mention?
No, I think you've covered everything. Thank you, Leon.
All right. Well, at this stage, a minute ahead of time, I might hand over to Mark Elliott, who is the facilitator for the next session, and it's a session I'm looking forward to hear what's happening in New Zealand as well. So, Mark, off you go.
Thanks, Leon. So, welcome everyone. Thanks for attending this inaugural Trans-Tasman Online Symposium on updates in ageing from both sides of the ditch. I'm Mark Elliott, as Leon said, and I'll be facilitating today. And before we go too much further, I'm an Aboriginal person here in Australia, and I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal traditional owners of this country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Now, before we start, I'd just like to address some housekeeping rules for everyone. Leon's touched on a few of those, but during the session, just want to remind everybody that your microphone will be muted. So we won't be able to hear you. If you want to communicate with us, please do it through the text box. Feel free to write any comments and questions in the chat box, which is located to the right of your screen. The questions will then be facilitated by myself to the speakers, and the speakers will address them accordingly. So yeah, we won't be able to hear you. Please just write your questions in. Please note if you have any technical issues, the AAG administrator will resolve the issues through the chat box. So if you're having trouble hearing or seeing, please let the administrator know. Now, this session will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording and PowerPoint slides in the coming days. And as Leon mentioned, when you leave the session, kindly click only leave training, and that will let you leave just yourself. Please do not click end training for all, as that will end the whole session for everyone. Thank you. Now, it's my pleasure to start introducing some speakers to you. And AAG Updates and Aging from Both Sides of the Ditch proudly presents guest speaker Dr. Oliver Menzies. Now, Dr. Menzies is a geriatrician and general physician at Auckland City Hospital. He's an honorary lecturer at Auckland University and associate investigator on the LILAC's longitudinal study of ageing. He's an investigator on the New Zealand Health Research Council funded project, the Kumatutanga, sorry for my pronunciation, Maori approach to the assessment and management of cognitive impairment. He is a co-author of the Australian and New Zealand Society for Geriatric Medicine position statement as Ageing and Indigenous Health in Aotearoa, New Zealand. He is a member of the Australia and New Zealand Society of Geriatric Medicine, and his research interests are in Kumata Health. So welcome, Dr. Oliver Menzies. I'll hand over to you, and again, sorry for all the bad pronunciations.
Thanks very much, Mark. Check, you can all see that.
Hey!
So I couldn't resist putting this slide up as my first slide. So I'm going to be talking about Oranga Kaumatua, which means health of older Māori. Who am I? Ko Ngāti Kahungunu te iwi, ko Nai te whatewhiti te hapu, ko Oliver Menzies taku ingoa, no Tāmaki Makaurau aho. I'm a geriatrician and general physician working in Auckland at Auckland Hospital. Just a quick note on pronunciation. Pronunciation is important in Māori, but we talked about this beforehand, and for those people trying to pronounce and putting in a good effort, Māori do recognise that. Just some simple tips. A-E-I-O-U is pronounced R-E-I-O-U, as in henare, so someone's name. A macron is a longer vowel, so rather than whānau, it's whānau. And an R is pronounced slightly differently, a R sound, as instead of saying korero, it's korero. I'm going to be talking about quite a bit of data, and most of the data comes from Statistics New Zealand, population data, DHB data, but also from the LILAC's New Zealand study. This is a longitudinal study headed by Professor Nairi Kearse, involved 421 Māori aged 80 to 90 and 516 non-Māori aged 85 years, living in areas covered by Bay of Plenty and Lakes District Health Boards. The research began in 2010, and if you want to know more, publications are available online. Just search on Google for LILAC's New Zealand. So this is what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll show the slide at the end as well. So ageing for Māori, cultural factors, roles, whānau, diversity, current health status, the mortality gap, age distribution, regional variation, disease prevalence, health determinants, health system and kaumatua, so thinking about the government and government initiatives, medical practitioners and kaumatua, so I'll say a short bit about that later on as well. So thinking about ageing in Māori society, there's a difference in Māori and non-Māori in healthcare, and a difference in healthy ageing, but some shared factors as well. Ageing for older Māori involves leadership, so not only on the marae, and there are special roles that older Māori kaumatua play, such as in this slide being a kaikaranga, which is a caller, and anyone who's been on a marae may recall people calling someone onto a marae. There's also the kaikorero, which is a formal orator, which is traditionally a male role, which forms part of the greeting. And traditionally, Māori was an oral tradition, and the kaumātua were regarded as guardians of knowledge and wisdom, and still regarded as guardians, kaitiaki, as well as leaders and teachers. Ageing also involves the giving and receiving of family whānau support. And thinking of whānau in particular, and this is LILAC's New Zealand data, Māori grandparents were more likely to make contributions than non-Māori in the LILAC's study cohort. So that's things like providing occasional support, financial contributions, teaching their language, bringing up grandchildren as a parent, so 14% versus 1%, shared parenting, 40% versus 7%, and older Māori were more likely to live with other family members than non-Māori. The Māori population is diverse though, and there will be some Māori that live in rural areas and have quite strong identification with their tikanga, their traditions, whereas there will be other Māori, often urban Māori, who may not have such a strong association. And Mason Dury, one of the giant codies of Māori health research, has noted that Māori live in diverse cultural worlds, and there's no one reality, nor any longer any single definition which will encompass the full range of Māori lifestyles. So coming on to current health status. This is what the population pyramid looks like for Māori versus non-Māori. So Māori on the left, non-Māori on the right, older age at the top, and so just a pretty rough comparison, you can see that the age pyramid for Māori is pretty thin at the top compared to non-Māori. This is Statistics New Zealand 2013 data. Thinking of the total population looking forward then, in 2001, Māori comprised about 4% of the population for over 65, but in 2051, this is predicted to look like 13%. So the older Māori population is increasing. Thinking of where Māori are distributed, if you look at this map, it shows majority of Māori are really in the North Island, and the larger population centres, Auckland, Northland, and also East Cape area. Thinking about life expectancy at age 50, so the solid lines are females and the dotted lines are males, greens non-Māori, blues Māori. So following along, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but following along, there is an improvement in life expectancy over time, going from the 1950s into the 2000 and 2010, but pretty much most of the way, the life expectancy difference is preserved all the way. So non-Māori females living the longest versus non-Māori non-Māori males, and about 6 years between there and there for female non-Māori versus female Māori, and male non-Māori versus male Māori. Thinking of ischemic heart disease, so looking at the relative rate of Māori versus non-Māori per 100,000, age 65 plus. Data is a bit older, 2005 to 2009. So if you look at the relative rate for males and females, there's quite a difference for Māori versus non-Māori. Ischemic heart disease hospitalisation, not so much of a difference there, but does seem to be a reasonable difference if you compare it for females with the mortality, bypass surgery doesn't seem to be offered as much to Māori males. Looking at diabetic complications, so we're on a vascular theme. Thinking of Māori in blue, non-Māori in green, so age 65 plus renal failure due to diabetes, so quite a large difference there, and lower limb amputation, also quite a large difference. So looking at cardiovascular risk factors, and we're getting to a bit more of causative factors here. Age 15 plus smoking, and this is 2014 data and 2015 data from Ministry of Health. Māori 42% smoking, non-Māori 15%. Diabetes 2 times more common in Māori, and deprivation there does mediate prevalence as well. I'll say a bit about deprivation later on. Heart failure and atrial fibrillation are also more common in Māori. Thinking about disability now, so this is from the 2006 New Zealand Household Disability Survey. Māori were 25% had a level of disability, impairment and mobility versus 19% non-Māori. Despite this though, there were no self-identified differences in social functioning, vitality, mental health or regular physical activity. Thinking then about dementia, so Lilacs New Zealand study data didn't find any significant difference in the prevalence of dementia between Māori and non-Māori when it was adjusted for age, sex and economic deprivation. And the note was made that bilingual status has in some studies been shown to provide some protection against dementia, and this may be relevant in the Māori population. Also that kaumatua roles may have a protective effect, so the roles that the kaumatua are required to provide in Māori society, and also involvement in things like kapahaka, which is movement dancing, waiata singing, and the role with assisting whānau. Just a short note about falls and other issues. About 34% of Māori fell in the last 12 months. Non-Māori falls rates are about the same. Māori drank less alcohol compared with non-Māori in the Lilacs New Zealand study cohort, and there was similar health-related quality of life. About care, 76% of non-Māori men and women with high care need lived in residential care, compared with 36% of Māori women and 50% of men. So quite a difference in the number of people with high care needs who are living in residential care. And almost all Māori had been to a marae within the last 12 months. Thinking then about determinants of care for older Māori. So a very brief summary of New Zealand history. So there was colonisation, there was loss of land, there was an introduction in guns and new infectious diseases, alcohol, smoking, and also one or two other things, such as laws to suppress the traditional Māori hinas, their tohungas. And if you want to know more, there's a very good book by Sir Mason Dury, which has got several chapters on this sort of thing. Thinking about socio-economic factors, older Māori have lower income levels, half the rate of income for investments compared to non-Māori, and they're less likely to own their own home, higher levels of deprivation, and I'll show this on the next slide. So this is 2013 data, dark purple Māori, light purple non-Māori, least deprived on the left, most deprived on the right. So if you go up the deciles, Māori are more and more represented in the lower deciles, whereas for non-Māori there's a steady, slow decrease. Excuse me. Thinking about other areas that are believed to determine Māori health status are Māori language fluency, health literacy, pollution and other environmental issues, religion and wairua, whānau integration, involvement in marae activities, urbanisation, which may contribute to a reduction in tribal identity. And this shows health literacy. So a poor level of health literacy. So Māori are overrepresented in that compared to non-Māori. And there is this graph on the other side, but that's just the reciprocal of this graph. Te Tiriti o Waitangi, or the Treaty of Waitangi. I won't go into detail here, but again, you can have a look in Whai Ora if you're interested further, or even Google it. Te Tiriti o Waitangi governs partnership, participation and protection, and really helps guide the relationship between the Crown and non-Māori and Māori. Thinking of the health system and kaumātua, now touch on these particular topics. So the government policies that are in place for older people, New Zealand Positive Ageing Strategy and the New Zealand Health of Older Persons or People Strategy. For Māori, there's the He Korowai Oranga, New Zealand's Māori Health Strategy, and also Whānau Ora. So Whānau Ora is one of the main initiatives that the government's been involved in recently. Thinking about Whānau Ora, this commenced in 2010. It's about coordinating care on behalf of patients and ensuring care plans and that plans really address client needs. It's thinking really about whānau as a whole and to not silo people less than a certain age or greater than a certain age, and promoting collaboration and really moving towards and trying to make families self-reliant. Overall, the results seem to be positive. This is looking at our Ministry of Health report. The Whānau Ora is delivering care to about 42,000, involves education, career planning, health assessment, screening, and about 50% of whānau say they are experiencing significant improvements as a result of Whānau Ora. Brief note, moving towards the end, brief note about medical practitioners and older Māori. So when seeing an older Māori person, older Māori kaumātua appreciate knowing who someone is, who they're talking to, and also being able to introduce where they are from, who they are. So establishing relationship in a consultation is quite important. Also understanding the background to their health, both personal but also collective in Māori. So I've touched very briefly on a history of Māori health in New Zealand, but these socioeconomic factors do affect Māori from the past up until the present day. Cultural competence is a phrase that's really been talked about more recently, and I won't go into great detail about this, but I guess for a medical practitioner it's reflecting on someone's own cultural competence. There's extra reading in the ANZ SGM statement on Māori health in New Zealand if you want to. Just remembering about the diversity of Māori as well. So some Māori will have quite strong identification with their tikanga, and as opposed to others who won't, and that does affect how you approach a Māori as well. Advocacy for Māori and supporting government and DHB initiatives is something that you can do to help support Māori health. So looking to the future, dementia prevalence may increase, so Māori are living longer, and also Māori do have a background of higher rates of smoking, cardiovascular risk factors, and noting that socioeconomic deprivation does increase the impact of dementia on whānau and people with dementia. We're working on a tool for cognitive assessment in Māori, and this is inspired by the KICA, the Kimberley Cognitive Assessment Instrument, and hopefully we'll get results out from that over the next 2 or 3 years. and eventually end up with an assessment instrument that we can use Māori. And Māori, I guess overall the last point, are living longer, and that's a cause for celebration. So summarising, ageing, we've talked about ageing for Māori, cultural factors, roles, we've talked about current status of Māori, we've talked about determinants briefly, the health system and medical practitioners. And that's the end.
Thank you so much for that. I found that very, very interesting, and I guess we'll have a chance to talk about that more afterwards. It's my pleasure now to introduce our second speaker for the day, and that's Professor Leon Flicker. Professor Flicker is the Professor of Geriatric Medicine in the University of Western Australia. He's a geriatrician at Royal Perth Hospital. Leon was trained clinically in research in Sydney, Newcastle and Melbourne, and was appointed inaugural Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Western Australia in 1998. He established a productive research unit aimed at translational issues, focusing on the health needs of older people, culminating in 2006 at the Western Australian Centre for Health and Ageing at the University of Western Australia. Leon remains a practicing geriatrician and is head of inner-city geriatric services at Royal Perth Hospital. Leon has served on numerous government committees addressing the health needs of older people. He is a past president of the Australian and New Zealand Society for Geriatric Medicine. He has published over 350 peer-reviewed articles addressing a wide variety of health issues in older people. In 2017, Leon was awarded Officer of the Order of Australia for his work with people with dementia. I think we're very lucky to have such good speakers here today. And I really think the knowledge these two speakers have are invaluable. So it's now my pleasure to hand over to Professor Leon Flicker. Thank you.
And thank you, Mark, and I'd like to acknowledge you and thank you for convening this session. What I'm going to be talking about is a bit different from what we've just heard from Oliver, and it's also a bit complementary too. But I will go through some of the things that Oliver said from Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander point of view. I'll just say that this work that I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues and been led throughout by Dr. Dina LaJudice, but this work, before we did this work, there were a couple of myths around, and in particular two. One was that firstly, Indigenous people don't live long enough to get dementia, and that any of the dementia that they do get was almost certainly due to alcohol. And then I'll explain some of the work we've done in the Kimberley, and also some other work that's been led by Tony Bro and Kylie Radford in Sydney and New South Wales. And I'll also talk a bit about some of the other syndromes of ageing and a little bit about ageing in general, but not very much, and so it'll be quite a bit different to what we've just heard from Oliver. So the first thing is just a little bit of the history, which is quite different to the one we've heard from New Zealand. In Australia, it's uncertain how long Aboriginal Australians have lived in Australia, and it keeps on going back. So currently there are some people who believe that Aboriginal Australians have been here for 50,000 years. There's some work that suggests that Aboriginal Australians have been here for 75,000 years, and they may be the longest continuous people who have lived in a particular place. At the time of colonisation in 1788, there was probably in the order of 750,000 Aboriginal people in Australia, and following colonisation there was a massive devastation to numbers, and it was by a couple of major problems associated with colonisation. Firstly, there was the advent of unfamiliar communicable diseases, particularly things like influenza, smallpox, measles. There was also a dispossession of land and water, which also caused a large number of deaths in Aboriginal people because of basically starving or inadequate water supply. And there was also armed conflicts. So between 1788 and 1900, the number of Aboriginal people in the country was said to be as low as 20,000 people by the end of the 19th century. In the 20th century, numbers have increased again, and now at the last census, 2011, the last recorded census, there was said to be nearly 700 Aboriginal people. So nearly the same number of Aboriginal people as was originally on the continent before colonisation, and that's about 3% of the total population of 23 million. And also, and mirroring the figures from New Zealand, male and female life expectancy amongst Aboriginal people is increasing, but the gap has remained almost the same. And so the gap is about 10 years, and the male Indigenous life expectancy is 69 years, and the female life expectancy is about 74 years in Aboriginal Australians. And this is the widest gap in the developed world. Some of our own work and in the Kimberley has highlighted some of the problems that you have in Aboriginal Australians versus the non-Aboriginal Australians. And although the commonest cause of death is similar, the number of people who have diabetes and renal disease amongst Indigenous people in Australia is much, much higher. And these are very common causes of death in Aboriginal Australians. And you'll note that at this stage, the dementia as a cause of death is not listed as one of the major causes of death in Aboriginal Australians, but this might change with better ascertainment of the conditions. I'm going to briefly talk about the Kimberley and also about some of the work we do. So this is the Kimberley region in Western Australia. It's the northern part. It's largely remote, and that's one of the major differences again from New Zealand, that Aboriginal Australians are disproportionately represented in rural and remote areas compared to non-Aboriginal Australians. So there's many more Aboriginal Australians living in remote areas than you would expect by the proportion of the population. And in the Kimberley, about half the population there are Indigenous, and they're often in quite small communities. These are some of the people who we've been working with over the years and some of the groups we've been working with. And I might say that we've had incredible support from the local Aboriginal people and the local health groups and groups like the Kimberley Aged Care Services, the Aboriginal Medical Services from the Kimberley. They've been incredibly helpful to us over many years now. So as Oliver alluded to, we initially developed an assessment tool for cognitive assessment, and here are two of the people who helped develop this, as well as our Aboriginal health workers. But here we have Dean Lejudice and Kate Smith, who were instrumental in developing the tool. And these are some of the community groups that and some of the health groups that assisted us in developing the tool. And it was a comprehensive battery which was tailored and culturally appropriate for the people we were seeing. And you can easily download this if you wish with the manual, and we'll explain how to use it. So this is the sort of thing that we're interested in. We're interested in orientation, some memory tests, looking at language and other aspects. These are the communities that we've been doing our work, and we've continued to do some of our epidemiological work for some time now. And this was our initial prevalence study, and it was actually a very, very high participation rate study. So we had over 90% participation rate, which I think is incredible, and just speaks wonders for how much support we received from the community and the clinics involved. And we used standard assessments and diagnostic tools, and we made diagnoses by 2 independent experts. This is us in the field, and this is one of our trained Aboriginal research assistants, and he's interviewing an older man out in the field, going through the kicker with him. So this is what we found. We found that dementia prevalence in Aboriginal older Australians over the age of 45 in the Kimberley was 5 times the non-Aboriginal prevalence. And you'll note that the prevalence, this increased prevalence, is being pushed by the fact that Aboriginal Australians are developing dementia at a younger age. And this occurs throughout the age range, but particularly at younger ages, the prevalence is much greater than you'd expect. And the prevalence of dementia in the over 45-year-old age group was 12%, and the prevalence of cognitive impairment not fulfilling criteria for dementia was nearly another 10%. It was very high as well. And unlike not consistent with the myth, most of the dementia we saw had nothing to do with alcohol. Alcohol-induced persisting dementia was only 4% of the group, whereas the majority of what the diagnosis we made was dementia not otherwise specified, but most of them were probably Alzheimer's disease in type, and dementia of the Alzheimer's type was the most common diagnosis we made. And some of the risk factors were a bit different, that being a man increased your risk, and having a stroke also increased your risk, which was expected, but head injury was also very prominent, and falls and poor mobility were common associations with this. Now, our study was thought to be very odd, and people said this must be something to do with the sampling, and this isn't typical for all Aboriginal groups, and it might be just something from the Kimberley. So it was really important that the study was replicated in other parts of Australia, including Sydney and also rural New South Wales, not remote New South Wales, rural New South Wales. And this is Kylie Radford and Tony Bro's study and others showing that the prevalence of dementia was almost the same in their area, which is in the blue, as we found in the remote regions of Australia. And both of us find much increased rates or prevalence fractions than compared to the entire Australian population. So very clearly, this is something not peculiar to just the Kimberley, and something that probably reflects Aboriginal Australians throughout the country. And the other thing that was very important is that this study done in rural and urban New South Wales was able to get imaging and other aspects, and quite clearly the majority of dementia found was Alzheimer's disease, followed by mixed dementia, then vascular dementia. And again, alcohol is a very uncommon cause of dementia. Following our initial study, we have done a follow-up study and to look at some of the predictors and the stability of diagnosis. Once again, I'd just like to highlight that this cognitive health occurs on a background of a lot of other health and medical problems. You can see here that the rates of hypertension are very high. The rates of diabetes in 45-year-olds is 35%, and rising to 50% by the time people are in their 70s. The rate of stroke is also very high. The presence of obesity is common, and heart disease is very common. So a lot of the health problems of older non-Aboriginal Australians are found at a much earlier age group. We did demonstrate that the problems we found in cognition did persist, and that the people with dementia, none of them reverted to normal, and unfortunately most of them passed away in the 6 years between the two in the follow-up study compared to the first wave. And cognitive impairment, not dementia, also had a relatively poor prognosis as well, with many people dying and many people converting to dementia. So overall, the incidence rate was found to be much higher. Now, one of the other things that we've been looking at more recently is been looking at some of the health problems of older people in the population over the age of 45. And what we found here is that some of the health problems that we associate with old age are also much more common in Aboriginal people in this over 45 age group. So we've now had 2 reports of falls, which are now between 31 and 33% in 1 year in the over 45 age group. And falls are a particularly important problem because of the trauma associated with it. And this is one of the very common problems that Aboriginal people get evacuated from the Kimberley and other regions because of the consequences of falls. Pain is extremely prevalent in Aboriginal people. Over half the people we assessed had a condition of chronic pain which was interfering with their life. Urinary incontinence, that's an underestimate. We found 9% in the initial study, but it's more like 20 to 30% when we looked at more culturally appropriate measurements for this. So some of the health problems that we find in older Australians generally over the ages of 70 and 80 are found very commonly in Aboriginal Australians. And as Oliver suggested, that there's relatively few people over the age of 65 Aboriginal Australians, roughly around 4% are over the age of 65. But within the next 20 to 30 years, that will dramatically increase with 3 times the proportion of the population living to old age. One of the important problems we found was depression, and depression was perhaps not as prevalent as we thought it might be. So we developed a depression tool suitable for people in remote areas, and we did find that the prevalence of depression generally was around 10%, 10 to 12%, but the point prevalence for severe depression, for depression as a major disorder, was about 8%, which is double what you'd expect in the general Australian population. So, so if we're seeing these problems of older people at a relatively young age, it then behoves us to work out what is causing this. Why are we seeing problems of what is normally associated with advanced age in the general population? We're seeing it at a much earlier age. And the most reasonable way to approach this is something that Tony Bro and colleagues have reviewed quite a bit, which is the life cycle approach. And that even from conception, there are multiple risk factors associated with Aboriginal people. The associations with education, socioeconomic status. Aboriginal Australians are disproportionately represented in lower levels of socioeconomic status. The life habits, for example, smoking has much higher rates in Aboriginal Australians than non-Aboriginal Australians. The presence of diabetes and hypertension, the risk factors associated with diet, and anybody who's lived in remote or rural Australia will realise how expensive healthy foods are in those communities, and this does tend to decrease the ability of people to lay their hands on reasonable food. And there's also the concept of this dispossession, what I described right at the beginning of this talk, which is the consequences of loss of land and dispossession and the life and the effects that this has on both the individual and community. And one of the things, as Oliver was saying about Maori, one of the things about Aboriginal Australians is they have a different view of health. And this was summed up by a colleague, a Aboriginal doctor, who wrote to us, health is much more than simply not being sick. It's getting a balance between physical, mental, emotional, cultural and spiritual health. Health and healing are interwoven, which means that one can't be separated from the other. And particularly for some of the people that we've been seeing, the presence of country and land is a very important part of that health status. So this is drawn by one of our research assistants, who is actually quite a good artist. And this is what some of the things that we think might be related to why people develop dementia and some of the effects it has on people. And you can see that this is something that does fit into the world of health view and of Aboriginal people, particularly once they've been given the tools to recognise it. Now, I'm very conscious that this has been a very negative view of health, and it's of older Aboriginal Australians, and I wanted to leave on a slightly better note. This is one of our participants. She's actually a very famous artist. She is, her painting is exhibited just within eyesight from the Eiffel Tower. She is an active, healthy woman, bright as a button, very, very prominent artist in the world, and many, many older Aboriginal Australians are just like her. So I don't think we should be all too negative about this world, but we do have to recognise that older Aboriginal Australians are more likely to have some of the conditions of older non-Aboriginal Australians at an earlier age. So thank you very much.
That's the end of your presentation, is it, Leon?
It is.
No, thank you.
That's about right.
You sprung that one on me a little bit.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for that. I'm sitting here listening to these talks and just thinking about the correlations between the two countries that we're talking about here today. Look, I want to encourage people to put some questions up. We haven't got any questions at the moment. I'd really like to see some questions coming in for the speakers if we could. There are a few things I did pick up on in those talks, and one of them is around the life expectancy of both Aboriginal and Maori people. There's a gap there, an unacceptable gap in that. But there is also so many other things, the prevalence of the diabetes as one of the health concerns. I think we have to agree that that's a problem on both sides of the ditch. Yeah, so I think that, you know, we should be doing a lot more work together on this. It's excellent that the research is around the same lines. Even though with you, Leon, around dementia, I've had the pleasure of being involved on the dementia side for some time. And yeah, I think that Kicker study in the Kimberleys, and then to go down into Sydney La Perouse and find the same prevalence there. Yeah, a lot of the naysayers went, oh, okay then. So it wasn't anything to do with being remote.
Oliver, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think listening to your presentation, Leon, it just struck me that the ischemic heart disease and vascular risk factors are really quite a common element across both Australia and New Zealand. The socioeconomic status is another common element as well, and I guess people's habits in relation to their vascular risk factors as well, smoking, education, and I guess that comes into health literacy as well as another common element both in New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah, I'd like to make the point though that New Zealand seems to be doing a lot better than we are. I mean, the gap, there's a much smaller gap between the life expectancy, and generally I think health services are much more tailored for Indigenous people in New Zealand than they are in Australia. We have quite a lot of service failure, and it's more than you'd expect from just being rural and remote. So there's a lot of service failure in urban Australia as well, and the reasons for this are complex. It's partly related to socioeconomic status, but it's also the way that people feel safe in those services, and they don't culturally, they don't feel very safe in some of those services, and therefore they don't use them, which means you then potentiate the risk factors that are already existing.
Now we do have some questions coming in. So I guess for you, Leon, the question is, can you please make a comment on the use of the kicker for assessing frontal lobe dementia?
Yeah, it's not a great tool for that. It's quite a bit dependent on memory. So people who have predominantly frontal lobe, frontotemporal dementia, or other cognitive problems associated with mainly frontal problems, it won't be good. There's a couple of things. So we now know that frontotemporal dementia falls in two major groups, and that is the one that exhibits mainly behavioural problems, and there's another group that exhibits language problems. My colleague from Edith Cowan Uni has developed a speech screening tool, which is really something that's required. So she's developed a tool that's, Beth has developed a tool that's very useful for working out whether Aboriginal people have speech problems, and that's one of the major problems with frontotemporal dementia. And as far as the behaviour goes, it's really important to try and get from family and other people an indication of the behavioural problems. And again, we have a kicker carer that does look at some of these issues, but it's really important to get that collateral history.
Thanks for that. Another question's come in for Oliver about the prevalence of dementia in his participants. Can you please talk a bit more about that? Was that surprising given the health inequities or inequalities?
So the fact that the dementia prevalence was similar between both Māori and non-Māori was quite surprising, and I guess some of the postulated differences were that because of the bilingual status of Māori versus non-Māori, that may be a protective factor, and also the fact that there was other roles that Māori were involved in compared with non-Māori. I guess one of the things was, though, that in that particular part of the Lilac study, the tool that was used, the 3MS, hasn't really been validated in Māori in particular before it was used in the Lilac study. So it's difficult to know. There was different numbers chosen for Māori and non-Māori, but I guess it's somewhat difficult to know whether that's exactly correct, and that was part of the rationale for developing a cognitive instrument for use in Māori.
Well, while we've got you there, there's another question that's come in. Could you please elaborate on your comment re the deprivation on health decline and provide some examples of this?
Sorry, the deprivation on health decline. So I wonder if that's just meaning deprivation leading to decline in memory, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it was lower socioeconomic status of the Maori people and leading to health decline, possibly. I'm sorry, but if the questioner would like to clarify that a bit more for us, we're happy to go back to that question. Is that fine with you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay then, Leon, is there any evidence from the neuroscience that indicates links between cultural trauma and deprivation with enduring negative impact of brain function, cognition, dementia, perhaps across generations?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and there is some work from Tony Bro's group in Sydney, and they've just in the process of publishing it. I think it's just been accepted. And this is the idea that childhood trauma increases your risk of developing dementia in later life by quite a degree. And so this is an interesting idea that the exposure of bad events in your childhood markedly increases your risk of dementia. So why is this happening? And we can only hypothesize. We don't really know for certain. But there's now been quite a bit of work on education and other aspects of early childhood, and it seems to be very important for this concept of cognitive reserve that you build up in your brain bank, if you like. You build up a reserve there in early childhood, and that makes you less likely to get dementia later on in life. And if you're not getting the opportunities, and you're not getting the education, you're not getting a good diet, and you're getting exposed to trauma, which upsets the brain, then this reserve is markedly decreased. So that's one of the hypotheses. There's probably a few others as well, but we are learning more and more that these early life events are really important to how people age much later on in life. And so again, it just highlights this life cycle approach to the problem. I've been a clear advocate for providing services for older people with dementia and cognitive impairment, and making sure that we detect older Aboriginal people with these problems and make sure we get support services. But at the same time, you can't ignore the fact that these early childhood events are really important to address as well. So you really need an entire life cycle. You really need, right from conception through to advanced old age, you need to address all the risk factors, including childhood trauma and the opportunities that children have within Aboriginal communities.
Okay, and just do you think with Aboriginal people in Australia being more susceptible to age-related conditions at an earlier age, do you think that what you've just said then might have an impact on that as well?
Yeah, it's, you know, it's not just your mental or cognitive health, physical health, your ability to mobilise, your susceptibility to strokes and other conditions that affect people's functioning. These are all really important as people age. So more and more we're learning that some of the risk factors early in life and midlife affect people as they age. And it's not just cognitive, it's falls, immobility, all the other syndromes of older people, what we associate with older people.
Now, we'll go back to that question we had earlier for Dr. Oliver as well. The question has made that a little bit clearer for us. Dr. Oliver, you commented deprivation of health decline, and its impact on dementia in Maori culture. What are some of your examples of deprivation? I work in the health sector in Queensland and I have not heard that term used before. I hope this clarifies my original question.
Yes, so my comments on deprivation were in relation to the statistics on the New Zealand deprivation, NZ deprivation index. So, and the slide that I showed showing higher rates of deprivation in Māori based upon decile. So extrapolating from that, people with more money are more likely to be resilient to the development of dementia in their family, so more likely able to purchase supports for their relative or friend who is developing dementia, more able to purchase perhaps private healthcare to help support that person. So that was my main comments in relation to that. I hope that answers the question.
Sorry?
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah, I hope that clarifies it for the person questioning it. So we've got no other questions coming in at the moment, but, oh, hang on a sec, I just talked a bit too soon. Hi everyone, excellent talks and very interesting insights, particularly the Australian dementia prevalence details on the age 40 plus and 60 plus. Oliver and Leon, how would you both see the infrastructure of care services professionally and personally?
So I might start. One of the problems we've had is being organising ourselves largely to structure services so they can be delivered in a cognitively appropriate manner, culturally appropriate manner. So one of the problems we have is that Aboriginal people don't necessarily feel safe within services. They don't feel that they're geared for them. Sometimes they feel that people make untoward remarks about them. So for lots of reasons, people don't approach services. In remote parts of Australia, a lot of the problems are associated with actually the complete service failure. For example, there may not be personal care offered in communities because there's just not enough people there, or there's not enough trained staff. There's one of the examples I like to give is that when we went to Luma and we developed a service there in partnership with the community, there were said to be only 8 people there in the community that needed community services. And once we started offering them, there were 31 people who needed community services. And these weren't just trivial. I mean, some of the people we identified included people with profound intellectual disability from birth who had never been taken up into a service because there was no service to access, so therefore the family and the community couldn't see why they should identify the person, because they were somehow coping and if they couldn't get any services, why identify the person? So you have all these issues of trying to make the services conducive to people with not just cognitive problems, with general health issues, and to actually tailor the services and try to get them running. But a lot of the problems are, not just Aboriginal problems, there are problems of rural and remote Australia as well. So you have trouble with scale. There's economies of scale in urban places. They're not the same in rural places. You have all those other issues. So, there's, one of the major issues is that even the planning requires almost a separate system of planning, and planners don't necessarily want to construct a new system for it. So even the planning of services requires quite a lot of intellectual work, and people are reluctant to invest that even for what they see as a small group.
And Dr. Oliver, do you have any comments to add to that?
I think Leon's probably answered most of it really. In New Zealand, I guess, for Māori, there's the problem with initially actually identifying that someone has dementia, and in the past there has been lack of sort of knowledge really about what the prevalence in Māori actually is. But then I guess more recently, Māori, perhaps not so much in terms of geographic difficulties for Australia, but Māori do live in rural areas more predominantly, and there are socio-economic problems as well, both of which will restrict access to services, access to evaluation and management.
Thanks for that. And now I think we're getting pretty close to time on this because I'm aware there's a very full program today. If there are any other questions that come in after we close this session, we'll attempt to try and get some answers back to people as well. And this has been a hugely fascinating session for me personally, and I'm sure for other people too from the comments that we've got in. I'd like to thank Dr. Oliver Menzies and Professor Leon Flicker and the audience for some fascinating questions and discussion. It makes me think about the many similarities and differences between Maori and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ageing, and the experiences of people in ageing in this country. Thanks again.
And thanks, Mark. And thank you, Mark.
Thank you. I think Leon was aware I was very nervous about doing this, but hopefully it's gone fairly well. Yeah, thanks, Dr. Menzies. Look, just a few last-minute housekeeping things. Just a quick reminder, the session recording of PowerPoint will be emailed to you in the coming days, so if you've registered for this, you will get that. We kindly request that you complete a short feedback survey at the end as you're leaving. There's only about 10 questions, and we really value the feedback. It essentially helps us understand what our membership would like and their needs. In addition to this, it will assist us to think about future topics as well, so hopefully we can have more of these types of sessions. Stay tuned for some more exciting webinar activities and events coming up in the year through AAG. And please note that when you leave, kindly click only the Leave Training. So if you're leaving it at this time, only click Leave Training after clicking the X on the control panel. Do not click the End Training for all. It will close the session for everybody. So thanks again to our presenters today, Dr. Oliver Menzies and Professor Leon Flicker. And thank you to the audience and AAG for a fantastic session. We look forward to seeing you again shortly. Thanks.
Thanks everyone.
Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for attending this Trans-Tasman Symposium, the update in ageing from both sides